That we're good to head in if everybody is ready to the prologue of the first in the Assistant to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer, who also does a lot of TikTok works and has their own headcanons on their TikTok. I highly advise you go follow her so you can get some of her funny content that she does and also get a copy of the book if you haven't already. It's really gorgeous. You can't see it with this light. That's one of the reasons I tried to turn in the ring light, but it's got the page edge color on it, and it's
Oh,
supposed to be red, but it just looks black in the blue light. So it's not awesome, but it does look really cool in actual light, which I don't have any of. So, also, there's a cool map that I want to show you before we get. It's just a fun map. It's not like a very highly detailed fantasy map, but it's kind of fun, and we love a map in here.
yes.
It's the villain's map.
But if we are all ready, then I will head into the prologue. Everyone muted. Everybody got your drinks, got a beverage. I have a glass of wine here. It's the premiere. Everybody get your pets. Prologue. Once upon a time. It was an ordinary day when Evie met the villain. Another failed attempt at the job fairs in her village. Another day with no source of income. Another day she was letting her sick father and her little sister down. Which was why her mind was preoccupied as she wandered to the trees lined like fences at Hickory Forest edge and walked right in. The forest had once been frequently populated, but was now the very last place anyone with common sense would choose to wander, especially alone. Well, unless your name was Evangelina Sage, and a forbidden forest seemed far more inviting than going home and admitting to your family that you'd finally found a job and given it away. Evie sighed, reaching out to let her fingers drift across the scratchy bark of several nearby trees as she wandered past. The forest really was quite beautiful. The kingdom of Renadon was one of the more modest of the enchanted kingdoms, and avoiding Hickory Forest when it took up so much of its land was a challenge. Still, its citizens had managed it well enough so far. It had remained that way since a dark figure known as the Villain's emergence nearly 10 years ago. There were too many rumors of him hiding out near the forest edge to steal victims to torture. Evie knew little about the evil figure, but she was almost certain he had better things to do with his time than to stalk the trees like a forest sprite. Though she'd not seen any of those either. They tended to live farther north. The villain, Evie scoffed, walking deeper into the trees and shoving her hands into the deep pockets of her simple brown dress. Perhaps he would be less murderous if his moniker wasn't so ridiculous. Unless, of course, the name had been bestowed upon him at birth, in which case Evie would applaud his mother for her incredible foresight. Evie stumbled over a wayward branch, yanking her hands out of her pockets to catch herself with a nearby tree, then trudged toward the murmuring sounds of a stream. As she walked, she sifted through her meager knowledge of the man, most of which she'd gotten from poorly drawn wanted flyers. In them, he was always portrayed as older, with a gray beard, broken up by large scars running down his face from grappling with his victims, and his teeth were often drawn jagged, like he'd rip your heart out with them, or perhaps needed to see a dentist. So many rumors had trickled through the lands about the kingdom's greatest foe that Evie wasn't certain what to believe. She knew the villain had burned one of the fishing villages in western Renadon to the ground years ago. The kingdom had been devastated with famine after the loss of fishing for months afterward, until they'd finally rebuilt. And there were many other stories of horror. Petty larceny seemed a staple of the villain's to-do list as well, often stealing into noble homes to frighten the families and make off with their precious heirlooms. Slowly approaching the stream wider than she thought it would be, Evie marveled at the beauty of the sun coming in through the gaps in the trees, giving the flowers bordering it an ethereal glow. For a moment, she almost forgot about her predicament. It was so breathtaking a view, but then it all came rushing back. Her father still didn't know she'd lost her job at the blacksmith last month. She'd been so sure she could find something else before her family noticed that the table was a little sparser at dinner, or that their small cottage was colder for lack of firewood. She'd have to tell him tonight, though. They were down to their last meager food stores. With a heavy sigh, she knelt down along the edges of the stream, her knees sinking into the spongy moss. She ran her hands through the clear blue water, then splashed some of the cool liquid against her face and neck, hoping to calm her racing heart. She was in trouble this time, and not from some mythical villain. No, she'd done this to herself. The worst of it was that she'd nearly had a good position handed to her. At the fair this morning, she'd been offered the sole new maid position for a noble family on an estate not far from her village. It wasn't ideal because of the distance, but she'd been ready to take it happily. Until, of course, she'd turned to see another woman standing beside her with such hope in her smile-lined eyes that Evie's heart had constricted in her chest. More so when she'd seen 3 young children standing behind the woman. Evie had handed her the certificate of employment and watched her face light up as she grabbed Evie and kissed her on both cheeks. I did the right thing, so why do I feel like my chest is going to cave in? Sighing and splashing another bit of red water against her face, she began to list the other upcoming job fairs. Perhaps she could travel to one of the neighboring villages. Wait, Red! Gasping and edging backward into the flowers, Evie felt her eyes widen in horror at the once clear blue water, now clouded with a deep crimson color. Blood. She shut her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. After counting to 10, she got to her feet, nearly tripping over the hem of her long dress, and inched slowly toward the water again. It was clear to see the blood was coming from farther up the stream. She took a step in that direction, inching one leather boot in front of the other, wholly unprepared for what she might find. The stream was beginning to resemble a river of blood the farther she walked up it, the opaque red engulfing any remaining blue. It had to have been an injured animal, a large one if the amount of blood was any sort of indication. Certainly not something that warranted Evie's personal investigation. And yet, here she was, in the forest that was suddenly getting darker as the sun began its descent behind the trees, following a river of blood. Shaking her head, she felt plants getting crushed under her feet as she grinded to a halt. She was going to turn around, in fact. Her body had been halfway turned when she spotted a beast with black fur, hunched over and hidden slightly among the tall grass surrounding the stream and a giant tree. Whatever manner of creature it was, the thing was alive. Groans and muffled sounds of pain were coming from its general direction. Evie crouched, gently lifting her skirts to reach the small blade she kept in a sheath around her ankle for emergencies. She'd put the poor beast out of its misery. Showing it that much kindness was hardly a burden, but the closer she inched, the less it looked like a creature at all. It almost looked like a human hand whipped out from beneath the black fur, which she now realized wasn't fur at all, but a dark cloak. The hand circled around one of her wrists, pulling her down beside it. Off! She hit the ground hard, her shoulder connecting with the forest floor as an arm banded around her waist and pulled against their body. She lay on her side, her back pressed tightly against something solid and warm behind her, which was when her good sense kicked in and she started to squirm and shout. The arm around her waist cinched tighter as a hand closed over her lips. A low voice was in her ear, sending shivers throughout her entire body. "Be quiet, you little urchin, or you'll get us both killed." Just then, Evie saw another foreboding figure across the way. Several, in fact. All men dressed in silver, carrying very large weapons, some of them glowing. The king's valiant guards. She struggled against the hand, but the man's other arm was locking her against him, and he wrapped a heavy leg over her ankles, effectively holding her still. "Let me go!" She dropped her knife when she fell, so she felt around in the grass for it with her free arm. "Relax," he ordered again. Right, that was likely, considering a strange man, whom she was certain was the thing these men were hunting, had her pinned to the ground. But she'd sought this out, hadn't she? She'd followed a literal river of blood. What else did she think was going to happen? "I'm such a fool," Evie sighed long and hard. Suddenly the hand was gone from her mouth, and the voice was in her ear once more. "What are you mumbling about?" "This is just very typical for me," she whispered. "Being pulled to the ground by a stranger," he said in a tone that sounded suspiciously curious. "Well, not this exact situation, but if I told someone about how I ended up here, nobody would think it was out of the ordinary." She jabbed her elbow into his ribs, causing her captor to curse and grunt. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did that hurt?" She did it again, making her point. "No," he hissed before he pointed a tanned hand to the man searching in the trees on the other side of the stream. "Those men do not care that you are an innocent who stumbled into the arms of a demon. They will kill you without a moment's hesitation, and they will do it laughing." "A demon?" Evie chuckled quietly, attempting to turn her body to get a look at this man with such a high opinion of himself. But his arms tightened around her once more, keeping her in place. "You know who I am, don't you?" he asked without a hint of arrogance in his tone, and yet the casualness with which he just knew his reputation had preceded him made Evie's stomach do backflips. She'd been called many disparaging things in her life, alarmingly all beginning with the letter F. Flighty, foolish, forgetful, and by a strange turn of events, she was finally able to add the final F. Fucked. She knew. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. The villain, king of darkness, haunter of dreams, had his arms around her. Worse even, she was not nearly as afraid as she should have been. In fact, she wasn't afraid at all, so much as she... Oh dear, was she laughing? She was, and she couldn't help it, and if she was any louder, those men would be over here in seconds. The villain seemed to sense this too, because she blinked, and his hand was wrapped around her mouth once more. "We're going to slowly crawl behind that tree." He pulled Evie up so she could see the large oak in question. "And then we're going to run." "We?" she asked as she was suddenly flipped around and shoved in the direction of the tree. There was no room to argue, so, as instructed, she kept low and crawled until she was safely leaning against the other side of the trunk. Breathing heavily and startled to see blood brushing the back of her arm, Evie turned to see if the villain was still there. Gone. "Where in the Deadlands did he—" "Here." Evie spun in the direction of his voice, stunned. "How did you get over there?" But her words were cut off when she saw it. In her defense, there was a lot to take in. Her first thought was that the wanted posters had it all wrong. This was not an older, scarred man with a gray beard. In fact, no gray laced through his thick, dark hair either. He had high cheekbones above the 2-day shadow that ran along a very hard jawline. She figured he couldn't be more than 6 or 7 years older than she was. If she had to guess, she'd put him at no more than 28, 29. That couldn't be right, though. There had to be a rule somewhere that evil overlords needed to at least be 50, maybe 60, if they were pushing it. But not young, and not even more disastrously beautiful. He was, though, beautiful. His skin was tanned and smooth, as if his off time from terrorizing people was spent lying in the grass, perhaps daintily drinking out of a teacup and reading poetry with his pinky raised. The thought brought a hysterical giggle to Evie's lips. The villain lifted one of his perfectly thick brows that framed the darkest eyes she'd ever seen, eyes that assessed her in pinched confusion. It seemed he didn't fully put together that she was another living, breathing human being because he looked at her as if her very existence was a mystery. You really should look like that, she said, and was surprised herself by almost thinking the befuddled look on his face was endearing. He's a murderer. Her consciousness rebelled, but the rest of her, the part that wasn't attached to her very wise brain, found him far too pretty to care. Taking a careful step in his direction, Evie tried to dig inside herself for the fear she knew was there. Any minute now, she'd be paralyzed with fright and run screaming in the other direction. But he was within arm's length now, and she hadn't turned yet. No fear, but she did feel mild concern, a sound indicator she hadn't completely lost her good sense. Until, of course, her mild concern was clouded with embarrassing thoughts of what it would smell like if she leaned in close and took a whiff. Is there something about my face that is displeasing to you? Or is it perhaps that I'm bleeding from 3 different wounds, courtesy of the men in your village? His voice was quiet, and outwardly he appeared calm, but Evie could see a muted fury behind his dark eyes. Did he think she was judging him? Oh, yes, the blood's not great. But I was referencing to the fact that you look like you were carved out of marble, and I just think that, as a rule of thumb, inherently, evil people should be grotesque looking. The fury winked out as if it was never there in the first place, his only response to blink. You can't just kill people and be pretty. It's confusing. Evie began unwrapping the wool scarf her little sister, Lissa, had given her on her last birthday, stepping closer to the villain and holding it up like a signal of peace. For the blood. Your evilness. Taking it from her in a gripped fist, the villain twisted the scarf around his middle and cinched it tight to staunch the bleeding. You think I'm pretty? Oddly enough, Evie had the feeling he would have preferred to have been called grotesque for the way his face twisted with distaste. That's not a think scenario. That's just objective. Look how symmetrical your cheekbones are. She closed the distance between them and placed her hands on either side of his face. His eyes widened, and so did hers when she realized what she was doing. You're touching my face, he said flatly. Yes. Are you happy with that decision? He raised one dark brow again. He's a professional killer, right? Maybe he'll murder me now if I ask very nicely. I was trying to prove a point. She shrugged, letting her hands drop back to her sides. Shaking his head, a small dose of wonder in his eyes, he said, You are chaos. Would you mind writing that out as an employment reference? I'd have a job within the week, and I desperately need work. Before he could reply, there was a quiet rustle in the bushes beside them that caused the hairs on the back of her neck to stand on end. Twisting her head in the direction of the noise, she took a wary step closer to the villain, who grabbed her shoulders quick as lightning and tugged her toward him. What? She heard the arrow before she felt it Pain sliced through the skin of her back as the arrows skimmed her shoulders, sending her reeling into the solidness of the villain's chest. That hurt. The words came out matter-of-factly, like she'd just gotten a splinter. They'd been spotted, but there was still no panic in his voice when he said, "It only grazed you. I know it hurts, but we must run." He turned her quickly but gently, and they started in the other direction, the villain with a slight limp from his injuries. "Put your arm around me." He winced as they dashed around several trees, Evie a step behind. "Why?" she huffed back as he tugged her closer. "You're moving just as slow as I am." A flash of amusement crossed his face like a burning star, bright and beautiful for a moment, then gone beyond the horizon. "I'm going slower to keep pace with you." It struck Evie then how her predicament had escalated from unemployed butcher's daughter to aiding and abetting this kingdom's greatest enemy in an alarmingly short amount of time. Good grief, maybe she was chaos. Had it even been half an hour? Which suggested a very delicate question one Evie should do well not to remind him of. But it was too late. The thought formed on her lips before she could push it back in. "Why are you bothering to keep pace with me in the first place? You could easily leave me in the dust and use the time they're dealing with me to get away." "Yes, Evangelina, give him reasons to leave you behind and explain why you were running with the villain in the first place. Sign your death warrant. Well done." He held her gaze for a second, still managing to dodge an arrow that whizzed by without breaking eye contact. Evie was jealous. She couldn't dodge a dead tree if she was staring right at it. "Such ruthless thinking, Miss..." She was pleased to hear notes of fatigue behind his words. He wasn't a skilled runner. He wasn't perfect. Wasn't invincible. He was, however, asking her name. "Evangelina Sage, or just, Evie." Okay, perhaps his voice was a little weary, but hers sounded like it had been through a cheese grater. Running had never been her friend, and running fast, she believed, was her mortal enemy. Was his only response, which was discomforting, since he hadn't revealed if he was going to take her viciously good advice and leave her behind. It was probable that some of the men from the village would recognize her, but the chances of them letting her live when they seemed in such a bloodthirsty state were slim, especially considering she was running beside the person they were hunting, who was probably about to trip her and feed her to the wolves. Of course, because the universe was against her, she didn't need to wait for him to do the deed himself. A stray branch hidden beneath the bramble jutted out just enough to catch the tip of her boot, and then she was falling clumsily to the earth. The call of more male voices was nearly upon them. They were screwed. Or, rather, she was screwed. The villain would probably take her wool scarf and ride his evil countenance into the sunset. She stared at the back of his head from the ground, at the clean, efficient way his body moved, as if the world was made to bend to his will. She watched the ridiculously perfect head turn to the empty spot beside him, and then back towards where she was helplessly sprawled on the ground. Back stinging, shoulder aching, with the addition of a large bruise forming after hitting the ground for the second time that day. The voices were closing in, and they sounded angry. Evie attempted to climb to her feet, to at least find a hiding place, but a familiar hand appeared in front of her, and she gripped it, despite the shock overriding her decision-making skills. "You fall down often." The villain looked her up and down as he said it, seeming to catalog the fact like he was making a scientific discovery. "Let's move, Sage." Ignoring the formality in his usage of her surname, she blustered, "The first time I fell, it was because you pulled me down." She gripped his offered arm for support, and they moved away from their pursuers as quickly as they could manage. "But you fell so easily. I barely tugged." You cannot possibly be blaming me for not being sturdy enough to withstand someone yanking me by my wrist. He didn't dignify her question with an answer, just gripped her tighter as they hustled through the forest like a pair of bandits. Eventually, the scenery of unending trees began to take on a darker tone, not only because of the fast fleeting sunlight, but the color of the trees was a different kind this far in. Long, twisted trunks and branches held warped leaves of a lush moss color, and the high-pitched screeching of strange birds filled the thick air, sending deep, unsettling chills through her. "Where are we going?" she asked hesitatingly. The little light that was left in the sky seemed to vanish within seconds, and night cloaked over them like an unwelcome blanket. Well, unwelcome to her, at least. The villain looked around at the blackness, and for the first time since she had encountered him, she saw a truly wicked glint in his eyes. He belonged to this. The night, the darkness. It was his. And Evie was still not afraid. So incredibly odd. To safety, my home and where I conduct my business. Evie attempted to pull her arm from his and turn in the other direction. Safety in a place the public has nicknamed Massacre Manor? I'm okay, thank you. I'll take my chances with the village brutes. His arm was a steel hook around hers, and she couldn't move an inch. She may as well have been welded to him. If I'd wanted you dead, I would have left you back there. She arched a brow. They were moving at a far more leisurely pace than before, the low buzz of voices behind them fading into almost nothing. They'd lost them, for now. The safety in that caused Evie's inappropriate curiosity to get the better of her. "Why were they chasing you in the first place?" she asked, angling her head at him in the pouch he gripped at his side. "Did you steal something? Weapons? Money? Someone's firstborn child?" The villain halted for a moment, and Evie yelped as the pouch moved. Before she could protest, the villain reached inside and pulled out a larger-than-average-size frog, so green in color that it nearly blended against its gold-rimmed eyes. It sat peacefully in the villain's hand, staring at her. She stared right back at it. "Is that frog wearing a crown?" Evie asked after a few beats of silent staring. The villain ignored her question, holding the frog up a little higher. "I will not deny that thievery is one of my better traits. However, in this case, those men were attempting to rob me." The dots were connecting, just in a way that was too strange for even Evie to understand. "Rob you of a frog that's wearing a crown." The villain turned and continued to walk, and Evie followed quietly. "This is no ordinary frog," he reasoned. "He can understand and communicate with humans as well as if he were one." The frog let out a healthy ribbit as if to demonstrate his fine communication skills, but the villain ignored him. "And he is in my care." The words prickled over Evie's skin like a warning. "Magical animals get auctioned for quite a bit of money. The men from your village thought it would be prudent to find out how much stealing him on my daily stroll would cost them." Evie gasped in horror. "And the crown is because—" The villain paused, raising his hand, holding the frog towards Evie as though the reason were obvious. "His name is Kingsley." Evie blinked at him for a moment. "Are you serious?" "Do I look like I'm joking?" Fair point. Evie actually hoped he wouldn't attempt a joke. The shock might kill her. He lifted the open pouch and gently laid Kingsley the frog back inside it before turning to Evie. "Just a little farther until we reach the manor." Evie followed, but not quietly this time. How do I know you aren't just keeping me alive so you can kill me in a more fun way later? What is a fun way to kill someone, I wonder? His face was inscrutable, but she could tell she'd surprised him again. Well, I don't know. I'm sure one must find some joy in an activity they partake in so often. She reached out a steadying hand and grabbed his shoulder as she stepped over a fallen log. His shoulder tensed under her fingers, something Evie didn't completely hate the feeling of, but his face remained impassive. You're correct. There are a few fun ways. He stepped out to reach once. She was safely past the log, and she dropped her hand back to her side. But I hardly have need to implement them when your two left feet will be your undoing. For the last time, I am not clumsy. I fell once. The first time was your fault, too. She strutted in front of him, arms crossed. I have my faults, your evilness, but one of them is not being prone to smack. Evie's head reeled back sharply. Ouch! She blinked at the open night air, wholly confused about what had just happened. A heavy sigh resounded behind her as the villain moved around her small form to place his hand against her invisible attacker. But the minute his fingers touched the space, a barrier began to dissolve around them in a flash of blue light. The corners of the scenery melted away, revealing large stone walls and a black iron gate. Behind it, high-rising cobblestone towers. His castle was hidden by magic that had smacked her in the head. The gate swung open, and the villain motioned for her to walk in front of him. As though resigned to dive headfirst into a moat of hungry sea dragons, she followed his instruction. Honestly, at this point, what else could she do? She'd exhausted any other options when she'd agreed to help him and let him help her in return. May as well see this through to its bitter, bloody end. Massacre Manor was far too large to just be considered a manor. It could probably house her entire village, plus another 2 villages of the same size, comfortably. It was dilapidated and crumbling in some parts, but there was a charm to its dishevelment. The stones making up the structure were muted grays and browns, moss and vines overgrowing in the crevices and spaces between. But its disorder made it appear inviting and mysterious, perhaps even a little comforting. They stepped around cracked fountains covered in more moss as Evie's gaze bounced about the surrounding garden. It was surprisingly well kept. In fact, she was sure she saw a patch of daffodils and choked back a giggle. But the grandeur of the space was truly the most frightening, as it somehow seemed to grow bigger the closer they came, increasing at the same level as Evie's impending doom. In short, it was huge, and what a very grand place to die. Swallowing hard, staring at the dark wood of a large door, Evie turned toward the villain, signaling a question with her eyes. If you push on it lightly, the door will open. There was a confusing dryness to everything he said, like he either had a secret sense of humor or he truly believed everyone else in the world was incompetent. I know how doors work, she said, exasperated. He squinted as if he didn't quite believe her. Then why isn't it open yet? Oh, well, incompetent people everywhere it is, your evilness. Let me get that for you, sir. A gravelly voice sounded from the window above them, and Evie shrieked in surprise, stumbling back into the villain. Hurry, Marvin. Miss Sage seems to be having some sort of attack. How long has he been up there? She pulled away from the solidness of his chest and found herself alarmed to catch the freshness of his scent. Shouldn't he smell like death, not faintly of cinnamon, whiskey, and cloves? He's one of my guards. He's always up there. As if they timed it, the heavy door swung open with an ominous creak. Evie followed him inside to the dimly lit entry hall. Okay, I'm inside your lair, your evilness. Why have you brought me here? He rolled his black eyes and trudged across the massive room towards several large stone stairs against the far wall leading to who knows where. He called out over his shoulder, "If you're going to work for me, Sage, you cannot continue to call me that." His strides were long, and Evie rushed to catch up as they began their ascent. Work for you? The idea was too ridiculous. I can't do that. You're bad. He froze on the second flight, leaning against a stained glass window. I am, he said, not even attempting to deny it. He walked towards her, looming. She knew he was trying to intimidate her. But you said you needed employment. She had? Oh, yes, she had, when she was in a ramble-induced state. Evie was used to people tuning out those musings, not marking them as job applications. I do, she admitted wearily. But why would you possibly offer me a job? What about today has told you I'm qualified for any of the kind of work you do? You have a cutthroat way of thinking I find valuable, and you helped me, despite all you've heard about my reputation. He looked down at the blood-soaked scarf around his waist. Your injuries! Evie reeled back, looking at him with disbelief. I completely forgot. Are you in a lot of pain? He grimaced, but didn't pull the scarf from his waist. I heal quickly. What of your injuries? The bruise on her hip was going to be ugly and purple. As for the bite of the arrow that had nearly flayed the skin off her back, it was stinging, but the worst of it had subsided. I'll live. She shrugged, neglecting to mention the additional knife wound on her left shoulder, put there by her last employer. That still hurt like a bitch. He nodded, holding his hand out, and said, What do you say, Sage? Evie paused, knowing admitting this could get her killed, but she couldn't bring herself to lie. Would you still be offering me this position, whatever it is, if you knew that my father was once a knight for the king? His face remained impassive. In fact, he looked bored. Is he still? No. It was well before I was born. It was just a way for him to save money for his butcher shop. He retired after he married my mother. The next part was painful, so she said it quickly. He's far too ill to work anymore anyway, and his only loyalties are to his family. The villain shrugged. Then I do not see why that would be any sort of issue. Well, that one aside, she was certain she could still find quite a few. What would working for you entail? She asked, eyeing his hand like both a lifeline and a death sentence. I have no interest in hurting people, or helping you to hurt people, or being one of your lady friends. Hand dropping back to his side, his lips twisted upward, almost as if he were attempting to smile. You're hardly the kind of woman I'd take to my bed. Evie's face burned, and the sting in her shoulder was suddenly no comparison for the burn of rejection she felt in her chest, which was ridiculous, because she hardly wanted to be desired by this man, but for goodness sake, she had a little pride. Putting his hand before her once more, his beautiful face becoming an impassive wall, void of emotion, save for the slight softness around his eyes, he said, I will be frank, I will not force you, but you know where Massacre Manor, as you so eloquently called it, is located now. You know that I am not immune to the slice of a blade, and the worst of all your offenses, you've seen my face." He stared hard at a curl lying against her forehead. She must have looked a wreck after running through the forest like a criminal. "You are a liability, and I do not have the time to allow Tatiana to weave through your mind, removing the memories of this day. I am bleeding on my favorite shirt. You need work, and I'm willing to give you a generous position with an even more generous salary." When she didn't move, he sighed and added, "And I can assure you, I have never harmed an innocent." "But what of my village?" she blurted out before she could think better of it. "What if I help you harm someone I know?" "That would be very awkward for you," he said unsympathetically. She narrowed her eyes at him until he relented. "I will spare the villagers from my truly murderous intents." His tone was agreeable, but she couldn't shake the feeling he was saying more than she was guessing. She couldn't believe she was actually considering it, but the thought of being able to provide for her family had her heart racing in her chest. Before she knew what she was doing, her hand was clasped in his. She'd expected it to be cold, but it was warm, and the sensation of his fingers curling around hers was making her feel drugged. "Fine, I accept your offer. What depraved things am I going to be doing for you? Your evilness?" Keeping their hands clasped and their eyes locked, he let a smirk dance across his full lips. "Congratulations, Sage. From this day forward, you are my new personal assistant." He dropped her hand and turned away to continue up the steps, but he'd barely moved 3 steps before he turned back towards her, dazed form. "And if you must call me anything, sir will do just fine." Chapter 1. Evie. 5 months later. There were severed heads hanging from the ceiling again. Evie sighed, waving to Marvin as she shut the heavy castle door behind her and strode across the main hall, her low heels echoing off the stone floor in tandem with her fast-beating heart. The villain was in a mood. One severed head was par for the course, a regularity that Evie had grown alarmingly accustomed to in the time she had been working here. But 3 male heads dangled there now, their mouths open in a silent scream, like they'd left this life in abject terror. And if she looked close enough, one of them was missing an eyeball. Evie scanned the floor before taking another step, hoping desperately to avoid crushing the eyeball under her heel like she had a few weeks ago when she'd ventured into the boss's torture chamber to relay a message. The scream she'd let out was no more than a peep, but if it happened again, she wasn't sure she could maintain such composure. She could handle a stray finger or even a toe, but eyeballs popped when they were struck under one's foot, and that seemed to be the line Evie's mind had drawn in the sand. She sniffed, walking forward. A fair one, if anyone asked me. But it was neither here nor there. The brand of horror she came across on the day-to-day didn't ruffle her the way it should have. Her need for normalcy had whittled away hit by hit since her employment began, but she didn't mind. Normal was for those who didn't have the ability to stretch their minds past the unreachable end. It was something her mother had said throughout her childhood, and for some reason, it was the one piece of advice Evie could not ignore. It really couldn't be helped in any case. She was the personal assistant to the villain, after all. She chuckled at the job title, imagining the ridiculous way the employment posting would appear in a news pamphlet. Must be well organized, must enjoy working late nights, and relish writing long documents. Must be comfortable and even supportive of arson, torture, murder, and must not scream when there is an occasional dead body lying across your desk. In the boss's defense, he'd only done that last one once since she'd been working here. After arriving at work at her usual punctual time, she'd cross the office, immediately spying the corpse of a burly man sprawled across her desk. Slashings all over his body, chunks of flesh missing. He'd been tortured before being killed, that much was clear, and the boss had thought to dump the man on her very organized and shiny white desk, which was set up just outside his very large, disorganized office. She'd never forget the look on his face when she walked in, saw the body, and then found him leaning against his office entryway. He just stood there, arms crossed and sharp gaze focused on her. Ah, yes, Evie had thought. He's testing me. But it helped that he didn't seem as if he were expecting her to fail. She'd grown so alarmingly used to that look from the villagers, she'd catalogued it in her mind under things that made her want to commit acts of violence. So instead, she'd sifted through every possible reaction that would serve her best in that moment, aka allow her to keep her job, and ultimately settled on simply being herself. Well, herself with a mangled corpse on her desk. She glanced at her boss, her chest tightening at the intense way he was staring back. It was almost like he was willing her not to fail, which made no sense at all. Maybe he had indigestion from all the torturing this morning and whatnot. Good morning, sir. Would you like me to work around this gentleman? Or is this your subtle way of telling me you'd like this body moved to a more appropriate location? She'd asked with a friendly smile on her face. He'd just raised a brow, then shoved off the door jamb and strode to her desk and the body. She'd bit back a sigh as black leather stretched over his thighs when he leaned across the desk, because he threw the body over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, not because he had very nice thighs. His eyes never left hers as he'd straightened and carried the man toward the nearest window and promptly tossed him out. Evie bit back her gasp, determined to prove herself. Besides, this job was still going wildly better than the last. Taking a large gulp of air, Evie had held the villain's gaze, ignoring her new interest in leather attire, or, more dangerously, his thighs. Very creative disposal methods, sir. Could I get you a cup of cauldron brew from Edwin? The ogre, who worked in the kitchen, made batches of the brown sludge derived from magic beans every day, along with freshly made pastries. She'd never heard of the drink before, but it enhanced work productivity and seemed to put everyone in a better mood, dead bodies notwithstanding. The villain's lips had tugged upward, his dark eyes dancing with mirth. He wasn't quite smiling, but it was close enough that her heart pounded in her ears. Yes, Sage, you know how I take it. She'd not come to work to find another dead body on her desk since then. But that didn't mean the last few months hadn't been challenging. For the most part, the villain tended to be gone a lot, likely villainizing the nearby townsfolk in some manner she didn't care to dwell on. They'd made a pact of sorts that he'd not pursue his evil doings within her village, or at least she'd taken his grunt as acceptance. But still, something told her even a dead body on her desk was going to be more fun than the mood he was in today. Because signs of excessive decapitation could only mean one thing. One of his plans had fallen through for the third time in 2 months. She heaved another sigh as she approached the endless, winding staircase. Evie stared at it for a moment, wondering why there was enough magic in the walls of this place to move objects on their own and keep the temperature comfortable, but not enough to make the stairs less, well, awful. She shook her head. It would be added to the suggestion box. Note to self. Suggest a suggestion box. As she began her daily climb, she avoided the door that appeared to her left after the first flight, the door that led to the boss's personal rooms. Only the gods would know what he did on his personal side of the expansive and decidedly gloomy stone structure. Don't think about his personal life, Evie. Another good rule for the list she'd been adding to like clockwork since her first day here. Stop trying to get the boss to laugh, Evie. Don't touch the boss's hair, Evie. Don't find torture attractive, Evie. Don't tell Edwin the cauldron brew is too strong, Evie. Her breathing grew labored as she climbed the second story and rounded on the candlelit banisters to the next flight, calves beginning to burn beneath the thick blue skirt that brushed the tops of her ankles. An echoing scream from the torture chambers and the dungeons below stopped her in her tracks. She blinked for a moment, shaking her head, then quickly continued up the stairs again. Despite his other obviously nefarious doings, the boss had a strange and confusing set of moral checkpoints that he followed rather diligently. First of which was to never harm innocents. To her relief, his evil was very much the vengeful kind. She also liked that his moral list included treating the women of the world with the same level of respect and esteem as the men, which, in hindsight, wasn't much to begin with, but at least the office rules were more consistent than the outside world's view. Before she worked for the evil overlord, Evie had spent her days employed by her local village blacksmith, Otto Warson, organizing his tools, handing him whatever instruments he required so that he could stay hard at work on the forge. It had been a decent post, one that had paid enough for her to support her ailing father and still be home in time to make dinner for him and her younger sister. Or, at least, it had been a decent enough position until it wasn't. Evie felt along her shoulder beneath her linen shirt to the raised, jagged scar hidden there. If it had been a normal blade, it would have healed properly. But whatever magic had been ingrained into the white dagger was now living beneath her skin like a curse, one so vicious that any time she felt an ounce of pain anywhere on her body, the scar glowed. A nuisance, since inanimate objects seemed to get in her way at an alarming rate. If there was something to stumble over, it would surely find her. Chuckling through another heaving breath, Evie began her climb of the final set of stairs. A lair big enough for a village, and he had them working on the top floor? Evil, thy name is villain, but she continued on to the person who had altered the course of her life. It seemed feeble to merely refer to her boss as a person. In so many ways, he was larger than life, but her being responsible for his every want and need had humanized him. The mysterious veil that lay over him when she'd first begun had slipped away, and a far clearer picture was set in her mind. Still, she had much to learn. Like what darkness lurked within him, that there would be 3 severed heads hanging from the ever-loving ceiling. She reached the top step and swiped a hand across her sweaty forehead, despairing over the time she'd spent making herself presentable that morning. A mirror wasn't necessary to know that her cheeks were flushed and the wispy hairs coming loose from her braid were sticking to her forehead. Moving down the hall, she could feel the slick sweat sliding between her thighs. A tempting thought of loose trousers danced across her mind. The boss had made it very clear there were no rules in the way his workers dressed, meaning for the first time in Evie's employment, she was permitted to wear something other than drab-colored dresses. But she feared wearing something as scandalous as trousers would draw too much attention to herself. Women? Have legs? Alert the town crier. No, she already courted enough suspicion in her small village about the mysterious jobs she disappeared to each day. Best to blend in so nobody deigned to take a closer look. If anyone asked about her work, she told them she'd gotten a position as a maid at a large estate in a neighboring village. It wasn't a complete lie. She was always cleaning up messes around the villain. Granted, they usually involved blood. Reaching the end of the hall, she pulled on the gilded sconce closest to the stained glass window, then stepped back as the brick wall slowly slid open, revealing the hidden ballroom that doubled as their workspace beyond. She hustled into the large room as the walls slid closed behind her and took a deep breath. The fresh smell of parchment and ink permeated the air in a comforting, familiar way that never failed to make her smile. Good morning, Evangelina. And now her morning was ruined. Rebecca Airing sat with her pool of administrative professionals to the left, everyone pausing their work to blink up at Evie now. Rebecca's eyes held Evie's gaze from behind large, round spectacles, and Evie said, "Good morning, Becky." She smoothed a palm down the front of her high-collared dress that was 2 sizes too large for her. "We'll see," she said, followed by 6 sets of eyes returning to their parchments as they realized there would be no bloodshed today. In all honesty, Becky was quite pretty. She was a mere 2 years older than Evie, but those 2 years must have added 10 in Becky's head by ways of superiority. Her light brown skin was flawless, and her tight-lipped smile did nothing to take away from her striking features. Her cheekbones and jaw sat at the same width, drawing your eye to every high point of her face. If her personality reflected even an ounce of her physical beauty, Becky might be the best person Evie knew. But alas, she was heinous. Evie smiled sweetly, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "Hard at work this morning?" The other woman smiled back, laying it on so thick that they could have repaved the walkway up to the castle with it. "I was the first one here this morning, so I gotta jump on things." In Becky speak, that translated to, "I was here before you, therefore I am better than you. Behold my fearsome attendance record." Keeping her eyes glued forward so she wouldn't roll them, Evie pushed through the throngs of people bustling around the room at breakneck paces. The boss demanded efficiency from every person he employed, and every person here desperately wanted to prove themselves indispensable. The hidden room was large and open, desks and tables laden throughout. Stained glass windows, depicting various scenes of evil and torture, were evenly spaced along the beige brick walls, bringing in a warm array of light over the space. The cobwebbed chandelier above them glinted as the light hit it, reminding Evie of the severed heads still hanging from the rafters below. She really hoped that scream from the torture chambers wasn't another head about to be displayed as well. She'd only been to the dungeons a few times, but never long enough to accurately assess the room of horrors. But a few of the interns had, and it was the highlight of their squeamish conversations near the kitchens. "It smells like rotted flesh and despair," one of them had said. Evie had promptly asked what despair smelled like, but the other girls just returned to their whispering. She had never been very good at making friends. For one thing, ever since her mother's disappearance when she was a child, Evie become far too good at letting serious matters roll through her like a tide, so they never landed close enough to hurt. She briefly thought this job might give her a more somber air, that people would look at her and see someone with sophistication and world experience. But despite every reason she had to become a dark and menacing character, Evie had remained exactly who she always was, an optimist. A terrible thing to be in a villain's office, mind you. Granted, she didn't want to become evil, but when you spend most of your life trying to see the sun, begin to wish for rain. In her most private moments, she wondered what it would be like to never smile again, to be feared the way her boss was. But Evie Sage was not a villain, and anyone who suggested she was would get laughed at in their face. Of course, was it any wonder everyone still saw her as the same when she continued to grin and bear it all? Like with the rest of her village, Evie had told her father a lie and kept him and Lissa in the dark about where she went every day. It was for their own good, really. Her father already worried so much because of the burdens he was placing on his daughters. Being ill and unable to work since he'd caught the mystic illness, a sickness that had plagued the kingdom for the last 10 years. The disease attacked without any rhyme or reason, seemingly selecting its victims at random. Some died quickly from the illness, the lucky ones. Others were left too weak to get out of bed as it slowly stole their lives like the worst sort of thief. Her father had had it long enough that the healer assured her and Lissa it wouldn't kill him, for now. But he was weak too much of the time to continue in the profession he'd done before. Thankfully, he'd been a butcher, which was a boon for Evie, since she'd grown up around blood and corpses, and now that very trade was her profession. Although seeing animal corpses was very different than seeing the corpses of human men. As she sat down at her desk and began her daily chore of balancing their ledgers, she'd reminded herself that at least today her desk was clean. She'd only been working an hour when something crashed against the wall behind her and made her jump right out of her chair, her rear hitting the floor with an embarrassing thud. Her arms had hit the papers as she fell to 2 hours' work, organizing invoices falling around her like paper snowflakes. Amateur move, Evie. She knew she always had to be on alert with her desk so close to the boss's office. She watched as the last paper drifted down onto her chest, not bothering to pick herself or the work up yet. Something or someone had most certainly been slammed against the wall. Another crash followed by 2 softer thuds and glass shattering. And there goes the framed picture I just rehung last week. Still on the floor, feeling ridiculous, Evie turned over and went to her knees to pick up the papers strewn about. "Oh!" she muttered softly, rubbing at her backside. But she might as well have yelled, given the way the black door of the villain's office jerked open, shaking the walls and making the rest of the workers freeze. Evie slowly looked up from the papers in her hands, her vision catching first on the tip of a shiny black boot, and then moving upward. Dark pants intended to be loose, but instead hugged muscular thighs that were attached to an impressive torso. Her eyes skipped past the loose V in his puffy black shirt that exposed the strong top of his chest. Even rumpled, he looked distinctively attractive. When her gaze finally reached his face, she had to swallow a sigh and bury it where nobody would ever find it. But how could she help it? His jaw was sharp and angled enough that it could be a weapon itself, strong enough to make her insides quiver. "Don't let the boss quiver your insides, Evie." She used to think the hardest part of him to look at was his eyes, a startling black that pulled you in, a web meant to ensnare your soul. They were the type of eyes that begged you to look away, but Evie ignored that plea because they were very nice to look at. And his mouth, perhaps the most expressive part of his face. Every change so slight, but so rich in meaning that she'd begun to catalog them. For instance, right now his mouth was pulled tight. When she glanced back up at his eyes, he was staring down at her. His head was tilted slightly, and her stomach did a flip as she wondered what he must be thinking about. Her being on her hands and knees like she was playing a ridiculous game of leapfrog. Is he confused? Confounded? About to kill me for my clumsiness? He slowly bent his knees, kneeling until he was eye level with her. Lacking the fundamental intimidation she should be feeling, Evie instead smiled brightly at the man the entire kingdom lived in fear of. "Good morning, sir." A muffled groan came from within the boss's office. Raising her brows and angling her head to look past his, she added, "Having a busy morning, are we?" The boss raised his brows back at her. "Quite." Shaking his head as if rattled by his own answer, he began gathering the rest of her strewn about papers before placing them on her desk. Evie put her foot down to stand and winced, earning a sharp look from the evil incarnate standing before her, his mouth twisted down into a frown. He was angry? Of course he was angry. Evie had interrupted his business by falling flat on her ass. She started to pull herself up with one hand on the edge of the desk, but the boss gripped either side of her waist and lifted her before she could protest. Not that she would have, had she had time to, because his large hands were, well, very nice. When she was finally on her feet, he dropped his hands in an instant, clenching them at his sides. Warmth stole up her cheeks as she awkwardly tried to look anywhere but at his face, afraid she might see a smirk, or worse, and landed upon the open V of his black shirt. Her mouth, for some god's forsaken reason, decided to produce an excess of saliva. "Evangelina Cecilia Sage, if you choose this moment to drool, you are never reading a dirty novel again." Too distracted by the patch of skin, Evie nearly missed the way her boss was assessing her. Not the way her previous employers had, but in a far more analytical way, like he was searching for inconsistencies. "How did you fall, Sage?" His words had a smooth sophistication, a lilting accent that only made his voice more alluring. "My chair turned on me," Evie said flatly, "and my rear end became very well acquainted with the floor." His lips twitched upward, and Evie felt like she'd just found a treasure trove. Twisting to put the rest of the papers down, she felt another sharp ache slide down her back. She winced. The ghost of a smile slipped from his lips, and Evie cursed her own clumsiness for causing it to disappear. "Do you need to see the healer?" he asked, placing a hand on one side of her desk, leaning down in a way that put emphasis on his strong forearm beneath the sleeve of his rolled-up shirt. Suddenly her mouth was completely dry. "No, sir. I wouldn't want to subject Tatiana to my war with the chair." She leaned in, gesturing at him to come closer into her confidence. He turned his head slightly, giving her his ear, and Evie smothered her surprise at him entertaining her antics. "Best to keep this between us, sir. It may enlist the other chairs in a revolt." Then the boss did something that nearly made Evie's mortal soul leave her body. He laughed, or rather, he coughed a lot into his hand. It was closed around his mouth, clearly masking a smile he was having the fight of his life trying to keep off his lips. Evie mumbled her shock under her breath. "That wasn't even that funny." The watchful eyes of the other workers snapped them both to attention, and before the boss turned to glare a warning at their audience, the crowd scattered like ants that saw a large foot coming at them. Except, of course, Becky, who kept her hawk eyes glued to the pair from the other side of the room. "See the healer, Sage. We have a big week ahead of us, and I can't afford you falling dead on me." "I don't think anyone's ever died from a bruise on the ass, sir." His eyes went tight, and his mouth did a familiar movement that even Evie knew meant she'd pushed too far. She took a tiny step backward. "But I don't hardly want to be the first, so I'll just head there now." She made a wide path around him, passing his office. She spied a scrawny-looking man inside, lying underneath a brick that had come loose from the wall above. No doubt after he'd been slammed into it. Kingsley sat on the edge of the boss's desk, as he always did these last few months, his wide, unblinking expression taking her in before his webbed foot lifted one of his tiny communication signs, this one in red chalk, reading, "Ouch." Evie had grown quite fond of the tiny creature's presence. He mostly just sat there, observing and offering up quiet counsel with the slab of slate the boss gave him to write on, his tiny gold crown always at attention on his slimy head. "Ouch indeed," Evie mouthed back to Kingsley before returning her attention to the broken man lying on the ground. She tried to muster the sympathy she should feel for the pain of another person, but she'd seen so many men come and go from that room that she was trying to save her sympathy for those who deserved it. A weaselly-looking man whom she was almost certain she'd seen throwing rocks at a group of ducks last week in her village did not make the cut. A smile graced her lips as she struggled to remind herself the boss was most likely not beating this man to a pulp to defend a few ducks' honor. Her mind also begged the point that even if he wasn't intentionally defending the ducks in question, he had by association. Which, for some reason, was just as adorable. She forced her smile into an even expression and continued forward to the small hallway that led to the healer's quarters for the bruise on her ass. Before she could throw her head in her hands at the disaster that was her morning, she remembered her boss on his knees before her, handing her the discarded papers, the sliver of his chest, his laughter. Perhaps her morning was not a complete disaster. Of course, there was no telling what his reaction would be when she returned to her desk and had to admit to him the discrepancy she'd found in the books that morning. She didn't know everything about the villain yet, but she did know that he detested disorganized record-keeping almost as much as she hated stray eyeballs. Chapter 2. Evie. "Bend over." Evie didn't move. "Perhaps you could buy me dinner first." Honestly, even a dinner at the nicest tavern wouldn't entice her to bare her backside to the healer. Surely magic could work through the cloth of her skirt. If she said it in her head, perhaps she could will it to be true. She sat on the exam table and held back a wince of pain when she shifted, her gaze holding the healers in a game of chicken Evie had no intention of losing. There wasn't a day since Evie had known her that the healer did not wear at least some element of pink. Today, the dainty color made its usual appearance in the form of tiny bows pinned throughout her lovely hair, making her look younger than her 27 years, but no less tough an adversary. The healer raised one dark brow at Evie's refusal to move. "Come on, Toddy," Evie said with a pleading grin. "I've already met my humiliation quota today, and I'm afraid revealing my backside to you would break the meter." Eventually, Tatiana sighed and pushed a dark braid of hair behind her ear, her large brown eyes narrowing as her hands began to glow a warm yellow. "Oh, thank the gods." The light drew Evie's attention to the gauzy sleeves of yet another lavish gown, hugging the woman's generous curves. Evie usually felt too guilty to spend her wages on anything so frivolous as a new gown, but that didn't mean she didn't envy the healer's lovely wardrobe. Tatiana moved her hands toward Evie, hovering in front of her shoulders without actually touching her, and suddenly Evie's backside felt like the time she had sat on the hot stones in the village square after a day of summer sun beating down on them. You bruised your tailbone, little friend, quite badly, in fact. Tatiana's voice was like clear water, crisp and smooth, pulling her lightly from her panic. She exhaled a sigh of relief, a bruise she could afford. Of course I have. Evie rubbed her forehead. And how much is it going to cost me for you to heal it? A long stretch of a smile spread across Tatiana's face, which to those who didn't know her would set even the most anxious person at ease. But Evie did know her, and that smile was, for lack of a better word, scary. The healer said, tapping her chin in contemplation. If you want it fully healed, I want 2 secrets. Which means you're getting 2 secrets, because in what world would I want to go about my day with a painful bruise on my backside? Evie rubbed her temples and raised a brow. How big of a secret are we talking? Walking toward her table of salves and potions, Tatiana chuckled as her dress swished back and forth. Nothing blackmail-worthy, but better than idle gossip you'd hear in the kitchen. Evie dug in her brain for something sufficient as Tatiana sifted through her tinctures and moved her glowing hands over a small bowl as she worked. Sharing secrets was hardly something Evie took issue with. She was an open book for the most part. She'd often had trouble keeping overly personal things in, especially with Tatiana. If she could pay everyone with her private, ridiculous thoughts and habits, she'd never have to work again. Hopping off the table with nervous energy, Evie wandered over to the shelf by the door and found a small bottle. It was a charming little thing. Evie thought it would make a good ornament. Don't touch that! Tatiana screeched, making Evie's heart race. What? Why? What is it? Evie frantically looked at the bottle and the hand that had almost touched it. Does it turn people into frogs or something? What? Tatiana shook her head, confused. No, it's a slow-acting sedative. It's very potent. Evie pulled her hand back as if burned, frowning as Tatiana smiled and said all too casually, I keep my frog potions in a different cabinet. The choked noise left Evie's throat, but before she could ask if the healer was kidding, she continued. The secret, if you please, Tatiana said, turning back to her brewing potion. Evie paused in contemplation and then grinned. I had a dream about the boss last night. A series of crashes and a screech came from the direction Tatiana was standing, but it was so unlike her to lose composure that Evie wondered if there was some other figure in the room she could not see. Tatiana whirled around then, knocking several more things over in her flurry to face Evie. Evie's mouth opened, her hand going to her face as if something was written there she couldn't see. What? There were not enough thieves in Renadon's East Village slums to steal the wicked twinkle in Tatiana's eyes. Oh, and what did you and the boss do in this dream, you naughty little assistant? Evie huffed a laugh and attempted to bend over to pick up the discarded parchments, but immediately straightened when she felt her injury protest. You are very presumptuous to assume it was anything but innocent. Tatiana scoffed in indignation, sweeping the contents back onto the table with a slight wave of her hand. A rare gift for healers, but a useful one for Tatiana, who sometimes needed to use her abilities to mind-bend objects out of a wound without touching them. Have you seen the man? As if anything associated with him could ever be innocent. She paused for dramatic effect, hands coming up with a flourish. He's a walking vice. Evie circled her hand above her own head in the shape of a halo, but the healer merely laughed and began mixing contents back into the bowl, hands once again taking on their warm yellow glow. I adore you, Evangelina, but you are far from innocent. Turning around and handing Evie a small brown bowl that smelled sickly sweet, she grinned. You are corrupt by association, my dear. Now rub this on your bum and put the gloves on first, or it will warp all the bones in your hands. Hastily tugging on the gloves, she grabbed the bowl and darted behind a cloth screen in the corner for some privacy. She yanked her skirt down a couple inches and smoothed the salve between the fabric of her skirt and the bottom of her back. As she did, Evie contemplated her precarious position working here. She'd seen truly horrific things in her time thus far, all more jarring than the last, but she'd never once felt the need to stop anything. Just the urge to offer help where she could, and distance where she couldn't. That was neither here nor there, however. Even the most stand-up citizens were capable of terrifying cruelty. She would hardly feel guilty for taking money where it came, especially from a place where she was never mistreated or looked at like a plaything. Nausea overtook her as she began to feel the broken piece of bone melding back together, a sickly, unnatural feeling. The body wasn't meant to heal at this pace, but she didn't have time to waste on a broken bone. And after the last of the bone fragments slid into place like a puzzle piece, Evie straightened, then turned and bent from left to right to test her mobility. The sharp pain was gone like mist on the wind, replaced with a tight ache that was far preferable. It'll be sore for the next couple hours, but after that, it should feel normal. Tossing the rest of the bowl's contents into the fire of the stone hearth, Tatiana rolled her sleeves up. Just be careful, the bones are still pliable. If you sit incorrectly, they can move. Evie wrinkled her nose, throwing her head from side to side to shake the image. That's revolting. Handing Evie a small capped vial, pink in color, Tatiana said, The next time someone asks me to describe my work, that's exactly what I'll tell them. Before Evie could ask about the vial's contents, Tatiana interrupted, her tone taking on a concerned softness. For your father. She rolled her shoulders and looked out the window. To manage his pain. I'm sorry, I cannot do more for him. A hot burning began in the backs of Evie's eyes, causing her to sniff lightly and clear her throat in an attempt to push it away. She carefully took the bottle and laid it in the pocket of her skirts. So, if I sit incorrectly, will my right ass cheek be bigger than my left? A startled laugh busted through Tatiana's mouth as she shoved Evie lightly on the shoulder. You are too gullible, little friend. My magic is strong and all will be fine. Now get back to work. Ignoring the lingering melancholy, Evie grinned wide and spun on her heel toward the door. Oh, she said, spinning back around. The second secret. Tatiana raised a brow, her eyes flashing at Evie for just a moment. The second? Yes, Evie said boldly. That dream I had about the boss last night? She leaned closer. It was dirty. Giggling at the shock on Tatiana's face, Evie spun back around, only to halt immediately in her tracks. Swallowing a lump in her throat, eyes wide as saucers, Evie said, Hello, sir. Any chance you'd like to add my head to the entryway? And that is the end of chapter 2. And that's all I have prepped for this week. But we might go 4 chapters a week? I don't know, I'll have to block it out because we're still done pretty early. We can always just go ahead and do Genshin stuff and read Cat Fact.